Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina McHale, and thank you for participating in today's 420th Justice Clearinghouse webinar. During today's webinar, Marissa McCune and Ron Nichols are here to share NIBIN-led policing, a prosecutor's perspective. What does it take to succeed in the investigation of crimes involving firearms? Well, first and foremost, it requires a collaboration of police investigators, forensic experts, and prosecutors thinking and acting together. Investigative leads identified through the use of the ATF National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN, are powerful sources for crime gun intelligence. However, to maximize the value of intelligence, both for the investigation and the prosecution of the cases, leads must be provided to analysts, investigators, and prosecutors in a timely and comprehensive manner. During today's webinar, we'll discuss how NIBIN leads, as well as other sources of crime gun intelligence, are utilized at every phase of the investigative and prosecutorial process. We'll also talk about specific procedures and strategies that have been implemented, as well as case studies. Our speakers today are Marissa McCune and Ron Nichols. Marissa is a supervising deputy district attorney in Santa Clara, California, and has been with the DA's office since 2006. During her years at the DA's office, she has supervised central felonies and general felonies before she was chosen to create and lead the office's Crime Strategies Unit in 2016. The Crime Strategies Unit is an intelligence-led policing and prosecution unit and involves large-scale investigative projects with the county's police agencies. Ron Nichols of Nichols Forensic Consulting has 25 years and more of experience as a firearm and tool mark examiner at the local and federal levels in accredited laboratories. He's also the author of Firearm and Tool Mark Identification, the Scientific Reliability of Forensic Science Discipline. He is widely published with a number of his publications routinely referenced in published court decisions with respect to Daubert and Frye evidentiary hearings. He's also testified in over 100 criminal cases and evidentiary hearings involving firearm and tool mark evidence at the state and federal levels. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to our friends and partners for helping with today's webinar. Today's webinar is brought to you in partnership with Ultra Forensic Technologies. Ultra is a leader in forensic analysis, providing innovative and effective solutions like its unique technology, IBIS. Ultra helps experts obtain timely information so they can make society a safer place. We truly appreciate and love working with organizations like Ultra who are so committed to enhancing and growing the profession. And now briefly, before we begin, I'd like to share with you some information about the Justice Clearinghouse. The Justice Clearinghouse is the only peer-to-peer educational program for justice professionals that emphasizes the multidisciplinary nature of an effective justice system. Through our year-round virtual conference, our audience and subscribers begin to develop a comprehensive understanding of the justice system while breaking down its many misconceptions. While our events are free to attend live, our subscribers receive 24/7 access to over 400 recorded webinars and are eligible to receive certificates of attendance that can be used when seeking continuing education credits. If you're not presently a subscriber, I'd invite you to join today and support our work. And the last thing I want to address there are some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded, and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes and will be available to subscribers on the Justice Clearinghouse website shortly after the show. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type as many questions as you have in the GoToWebinar toolbar. We'll take as many of your questions as possible at the end of the webinar. Next, if you do experience audio issues during your webinar today, such as the audio cutting in and out intermittently, consider dialing in using the phone number that was included in your email invite. When the system asks you for a PIN, you can simply bypass that by hitting the pound key. Also, we do have several polling questions during our webinar today, and so just by way of a trial run, I'd like to learn how much continuing education does your profession require on an annual basis? Your options are 0, 1 to 10 hours or CEUs, 11 to 20 hours, 21 to 30 hours, or more than 30 hours. And I'll go ahead and give you all just a few seconds to think through those options and choose the right one. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results. 34% of you said that you have no continuing education required on an annual basis. 17% of you said 1 to 10 hours. 19% of you said 11 to 20 hours. 9% of you said 21 to 30 hours. And 20% of you said more than 30 hours. Fascinating. Thank you guys so much for getting that information into us so quickly. And finally, after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey, and we do ask that you complete it. Your feedback helps us shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. And so with that, let's turn our presentation over to our instructors for the day. Ron, it's all yours.
Thank you, Chris. If we could, we have a couple polling questions for you, so we're going to hold these up there for a little bit. So if you could respond to this poll question. For non-prosecutors, in the past, how many cases have you collaborated with prosecutors on a prosecution of a case?
And folks, the polling is open. Again, your question is specifically for the non-prosecutors. In the past, how many cases have you collaborated with the prosecutors on the prosecution of a case? None, 1 to 4, or more than 5 cases. I'll give everybody just a few more seconds. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results with everybody. Ron, 29% of the audience said none. 22% of the audience said 1 to 4 cases. And 49% of the audience said 5 or more cases.
Thank you very much. And now we have another polling question as well. For all prosecutors, how many cases have you prosecuted involving either an unconfirmed NIBIN lead or a confirmed NIBIN hit? So please select 1, none, 1 to 4, or 5 or more.
And again, folks, this question is for just the prosecutors. How many cases have you prosecuted involving either an unconfirmed NIBIN hit, or NIBIN lead, or a confirmed NIBIN hit? None, 1 to 4, or 5 or more. We'll give everybody just a few more seconds to go ahead and get your votes in. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and share the results. Ron, 44% said none, 25% said 1 to 4, and 31% said 5 or more.
Thank you very much. That gives us a good sense of where individuals are at that are actually attending the webinar. And this is going to be very helpful because this is specifically what we're looking at. We're looking at being able to collaborate all aspects of an investigation, from the forensic side to the investigation side to the prosecution side. Because what we're going to find is that collaboration is going to be the key to successful crime gun strategies. Next. There was a quote in a recent article that I read, and this article was related to a DNA backlog in a state agency regarding rape kits, when the only contention in that investigation was whether it was consensual sex or rape. And what was ending up happening is the prosecutors wanted the DNA kits processed regardless of what was being said with respect to the conditions or the circumstances of the case. And the laboratory director made this statement: "We have problems within the 4 walls of the lab, certainly. There are issues within the laboratory system, and we're getting at that. But outside the lab, in the investigative process, in the court process, there are delays that frankly are artificial." And as an example, when I worked in forensic labs, one of the things we would have are submission sheets. And these submission sheets would indicate everything that was needed for a particular case. And routinely what we had is If there was a checkbox to be checked, it was generally checked by the investigators, because it was almost like, well, just submit it, let them sort it out, we'll check everything. And therefore, we didn't know really what was necessary for the investigation and prosecution of the case, or what was not necessary. In many instances, there were guns that were recovered on the person himself or herself, and we were requested to do fingerprint analysis on the gun, even though it was recovered on their person. Next. The criminal justice system, though, just has too many components for everyone to get their supposed needs met. I've heard often in conversations, but I need this, and I need this. And the question is it truly a need? Because when one component's wants or desirables turn into needs, it causes the entire system to bind up and become unworkable. For example, I worked with the city of Oakland for a number of years, and we had a system in place where we would analyze drug cases within 24 hours and get the DA's office the results of any drug case within 24 hours of the actual arrest. And basically, we did that for charging purposes. So we identified if it was cocaine, we identified if it was methamphetamine, marijuana, or a host of others. And we would do that in time for charging. But in order to facilitate that, we had to set certain standards. One of the standards was that we wouldn't analyze more than 5 samples if it was a possession for sale case. And there are times that we had attorneys call up and say, well, I want more analyzed. And basically I said, well, we have a system in place where your office agreed that you would prosecute a possession for sale case on 5 samples. And he said, yeah, I know that, but I just want more because it's my case and I just want to make it easier. Well, making it easier for someone means that I can't do my job for someone else. So it's important to understand and really come up with what our wants and desires are versus what our actual needs are. Next. I love movies and I love quotes. And Jurassic Park is one of my favorite movies. In fact, I watched it the other day. And Ian Malcolm, I remember what he said one time, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. The syndrome that we have with respect to needing and wanting things is not limited to investigators or prosecuting offices. Crime labs also have a tendency to act before they consider the ramifications and potential consequences of what they're doing. For example, processing fired cartridge cases for DNA. Cynthia Cale performed research on secondary DNA transfer and reported the following in 2015. Her experiments began with a 2-minute handshake between 2 people. Then handling a knife led to the DNA profile of the person who never touched the weapon being identified on the swab of the weapon handle in 85% of the samples. This study is entitled, Could Secondary DNA Transfer Falsely Place Someone at the Scene of a Crime? In 1/5 of those experiments, the person who had never directly touched the knife was identified as the main or only contributor of the DNA on the handle, according to that study. There was one particular case in California that made headlines. A man spent months in prison on a murder charge before it was proven that he was hospitalized and so drunk he was incapacitated at the time of the killing in the actual hospital. It was later discovered that the same first responders who had treated him and transported him for medical attention shortly afterward responded to that crime scene of a homicide. So it's a secondary transfer of DNA. And the issue is when we're looking at trace DNA, such as from fire cartridge cases, whose DNA are we actually recovering? Is it the individual in that was responsible for that shooting? Next. So when we look at things, each component has to honestly evaluate what elements are essential, important, and desirable, and then come together in a spirit of collaboration to prioritize the elements for the common good. And the common good is for the community at large. It's not for my office, it's not for your office, it is for the community at large, because in the end, we are all public servants. And it is important that whatever we do truly serve the community in the best way that we can. Next. I have found a lot of agencies, especially crime labs, begrudgingly cooperate, but that's not enough. It is not enough to tell partners to get on board and just simply deal with it. There has to be an active spirit of collaboration, which goes beyond simple cooperation. Because when we cooperate, we tend to do just what needs to be done to get past a problem. But when we collaborate, we take ownership of our role in responding to that problem. When we cooperate, we become part of someone else's solution, and it is not a high priority for us. But when we collaborate, we become a source of a team-based solution. When we cooperate, we end up resenting our role and look for failings in others to absolve ourselves of responsibility to do our part. But when we collaborate, we understand our role is vital and we take responsibility for ourselves without concern for what others are not doing. We don't finger point. We just press in and continue to do our part. And finally, when we cooperate, we end up reacting to crimes that have already happened without any vision for the future. But when we collaborate, we are responding to a crime problem, hopefully reducing it in the future. Next. And with that, I told you I'm a movie fan. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Marissa of the Santa Clara County District Attorney Office in California for her portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Ron. Hi, everybody. I'm thrilled to be with you. We're going to go ahead and start with the next slide to give you a bit of context on my jurisdiction. So I'm a prosecutor in San Jose, California. Santa Clara County is our jurisdiction, and it is massive geographically and in population. So because I'm sure we have a very diverse audience from lots of different size jurisdictions, I just want you all to know that if we can make a solution work with a county of 2 million people, with 15 major police departments, then it's certainly something that can be replicated in other jurisdictions with a little bit of teamwork, as Ron just stated, and with shared common goals in the spirit of collaboration. So San Jose Police Department is our largest. We can go to the next slide. In Santa Clara County, we really started looking at our NIBIN issue and our gun issue in San Jose. That's where most of our violent crime is located. But we had a unique issue in San Jose. It is a city of 1 million residents with overall low crime, but it had 10 years of increasing violent crime. And part of that, and part of the challenge we faced here, is that we were hemorrhaging police officers between 2012 and 2014 due to local issues that were going on here. And so we have a very lean staffed police department, and that made it challenging for them on their own to really tackle the issue of linked shell casings and NIBIN and solving shootings without a collaborative approach. So if we can go to the next slide. One of the things that we were facing in San Jose that was urgently in need of attention was this right here, which was that gun crime is nearly doubling between 2006 and 2017 and 18. On the slide on the left, by the way, at the time that we created this PowerPoint, I did not yet even have our 2018 Ag Assaults with a Gun, but they were up even higher last year, unfortunately. So there was a real need for a new approach, or I would say some assistance from outside agencies to help wrap our hands around what we could do to address gun violence. And so if your jurisdiction is experiencing something like this, I highly recommend that you start by looking at the scope of your problem and then using that to encourage your partners to try something new. Let's go to the next slide. So that was the context in which my unit was born. I'm a prosecutor, and my unit is formed by the Police Chiefs Association. So in September of 2016, they formed and funded a countywide crime strategies unit. I'm a supervisor at the DA's office, but I also have investigative staff. I have attorneys underneath me. But most importantly, in bright blue, I have a lead intelligence analyst and 2 other intel analysts who are highly skilled. They actually are employees of our fusion center out here, the NICRIC, and they are really at the heart of what we are doing to address gun-related intelligence from a NIBIN-led perspective. And so looking at kind of like what I have in my toolbox here at the DA's office, I have the ability to both investigate and analyze the gun problem and see it through with prosecution. I have my interns on there because they also help us doing some of the legwork, and I'll talk a little bit about how great it is to have some free help. If we look at the next slide, I want to talk about where we started with wrapping our hands around guns in our county. So understanding that we had a violent crime, specifically gun-led issue in our county, and a police force that really needed some outside assistance. In December of 2016, we led a gap analysis in Santa Clara County. I was joined by the great Pete Gagliardi, former ATF, who is absolutely critical in building our program out here and really guiding us towards a workable solution. All county law enforcement from all of the agencies, including their property staff, the lab, investigators from the detective bureaus, got together to discuss gun collection and submission protocol, and also how are we analyzing guns and expended casings when they got to the lab. What we found in our county, and I'm sure this is common to many of you listening, is that police were not submitting all guns or casings. And I got to be honest with you, when we discovered this, it was actually kind of a surprise to some of the police departments just how few of their guns were making it over. Like, I think if you asked, people in the homicide unit, they would have said, yeah, of course all our guns are going over. And then when we looked at the actual numbers, no, they weren't. And many casings were making it over, some guns were making it over. But what we found, and I suspect you also have this too in your jurisdiction, is that there was a real gap between patrol and the investigative bureau on this. And so we needed to really work on universal selection and submission of guns and casings. Another gap that we found was at our lab, that they had a huge delay in doing NIBIN work, firearms work in general, which could in some instances take up to 18 months to turn around. So what we really heard from them is that in order to deal with the workload and address this issue in a timely fashion, they needed more staff. So we worked to plug the gaps with the lab, hiring 5 new lab technicians to work in the firearms unit to streamline intake and to really address some of the issues of guns coming over in with more frequency. And by the way, this was not an easy process, and you can't just snap your fingers and do this overnight, but it was critical to have the gap analysis to show that this was a need in order to justify adding staff. So if you're looking at doing something like that, I'd be happy to talk to you about our experience. It was not smooth, and in retrospect, I think we learned some things in the process. So plugging the gaps with police, though, was and remains one of our biggest ongoing roles and issues in our county, which is to train police about why it is so important to get guns over quickly on every single found and evidence gun. And this is a major departure from the way that we were doing things in the past. So, given that we both had a backlog and we are now encouraging the police to submit more guns than ever before, that's going to create a huge amount of work for the crime lab. So I think that knowing that going in, if you're going to start something like this, it's really important, and this is one of the things that we learned through this process, to hear from your lab, kind of like how Ron started at the beginning, about how can we make this easier and better for you. And so much of this is communication. So if there's unnecessary work that's being requested, that's going to slow things down. If you don't need to print and DNA swab every gun because it was found in his waistband, please do not ask your lab to do that. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we work together, or try to work together, to really streamline the necessary work and eliminate the unnecessary. So let's talk about how we do that in our county. We created a gun-related intelligence program in 2017. So right around the same time that we completed our gap analysis was the time that we really said, we need this in our county. We need a real crime gun intelligence center model. We call it GRIP because we couldn't call it a CJIC. And here's our workflow. We intake ballistics, or intake firearms evidence, doing safety, preserving, and e-trace. That's done, of course, by the police in the field to get those guns and evidence items. Once it gets to the lab, there is an analysis done of whether or not prints or DNA are necessary on the weapons, and that's going to come down to whether or not possession ultimately is an issue in the case facts. Then the firearms work begins. There's NIBIN entry done on 100% of eligible firearms that go to our crime lab. To the extent that a NIBIN hit is developed, it comes to GRIP, and I'll talk about our workflow in a second. But ultimately, this bottom line right here on action is the goal, right? None of this work, none of all this hard work by any of the members of this system means anything if we can't ultimately successfully identify and prosecute the shooters and crime drivers. So that's a critical component, and that's why it's a benefit that it is overseen and really done in collaboration with the prosecutors. On to our next slide. Here is what the GRIP workflow looks like. So it starts off with a NIBIN lead. When we are parties at the Crime Strategies Unit, my analysts are a party to 100% of NIBIN lead emails that are coming from the crime lab. If this is not happening in your jurisdiction, you should really start by figuring out who receives the emails, because a massive gap in our county that we discovered in the process of doing this was that very frequently NIBIN leads were happening and they were being sent, the notifications were being sent to an email that was either getting deleted because the person had moved on to a new assignment, had rotated out of the detective bureau back onto patrol, or we're going to an email address of, that wasn't being checked because the person had retired or changed assignments. I guarantee that this is happening somewhere in your jurisdictions. That work that is being done, but through the hardworking people at the firearms lab who actually get it done in a timely fashion, and they're like, oh my God, we have a lead. Nobody knows about it. And this is vital. So the massive process that we go through at GRIP is to help address this. Somebody needs to get eyes on the lead. Somebody needs to triage it. There needs to be support to determine, is this a solvable case or is it not? And very frequently these cases, we would say, are still what we call non-workers. So yes, you have expended shell casings from 2 different shots fired calls, but there's no other details that would turn this into a, I would say, solvable case. But very frequently, with some support and analysis from our unit and the detectives that we work with, we're able to actually convert this into a suspect and then convert it into a fileable case. And we're going to show that in a second. But I just want to underscore this huge point, which is, if you take nothing else away from this, I would say go back to the different system partners in your county. And if you don't know who they are, there should be, at a minimum, an email string where you all can communicate about what is our workflow? What does it look like when the lab gets a lead? Who does it go to? Is anybody reading it? Because the answer is very frequently likely to be no. So that's a big role that we support. We host weekly meetings to determine what support is needed to share intelligence. We analyze cases and findings are reported to stakeholders. And then we maintain intelligence on all gun crimes in the county. We're going to look at that in a second. So let's look at our next slide to really get into the nitty-gritty of how our program runs. So really, my analysts are so essential to this because they maintain our record keeping, they maintain oversight and intelligence about the leads that are happening, what neighborhoods are being affected by gun crime, what crime drivers are being apprehended with guns. And what happens functionally is when a NIBIN lead is generated from our crime lab, as I told you, we get an email in 100% of those leads, and then a GRIP analyst opens what's called a GRIP case. So a GRIP case is every single subsequent link to a single gun from a shell casing or a recovered firearm. And as we get more and more, some of these cases are just a recovered gun links to shell casings from a prior shooting. Okay, fine. But there are very frequently instances where the same gun has been used in 7, 8, or in some instances 9 shootings where we don't yet have the gun, but we have shell casings from all of these different instances. Every time that a new case is linked to that same gun, it goes to the same grip case number so that we can maintain continuity and analyze the flow of these weapons and try to identify who's likely in possession of the gun or who was at the time of the associated shootings. So the grip cases are kept in an internal SharePoint. And then if we look here on this slide that has just come up, we have a massive internal way of tracking different data points. And so for those of you who are really going to be doing or who are currently doing a Crime Gun Intelligence Center or a NIBIN program, I highly encourage you to work with your system partners and stakeholders on what information do you want us to track. And what we did in creating this spreadsheet was we talked to our lab about what stuff would they like us to track. So for the lab, things that were important were like lab case numbers, date of submission, date of NIBIN lead, caliber, make, model of weapon. And to the investigators, there was different things that were important, such as location of incident, again, caliber, make, model of weapon, and the investigative agency. So in some instances, it was important to know that there was a gun that was crossing jurisdictional lines, right? So all of these things are maintained in a centralized location. It's sortable, filterable, but more importantly, allows us to report out to our stakeholders certain metrics. So at the end of the year, we can tell you how many guns were recovered. So we have a filter on here for CGR, which stands for crime gun recovery. So how many of our NIBIN leads actually were from a recovered gun as opposed to just shell casings at crime scenes? How many of these were from San Jose Police Department? How many of these were homicides involved in the series? And all of this is maintained by our analysts so that our partners can really know what the workflow looks like over here, and so that our crime lab can help understand the volume and the nature of the work that they're doing so that we can report out on really critical components of what gun crime looks like in our county. And then we use this, you'll see on here, just before we move on, that one of the things that we keep in here is the latitude and longitude of these incidents so that this data is mappable. And so for those of you who are on the call who are analysts yourself or work with analysts, this is vital, as you'll see, to some of the work that we have built out in this program. So if you're looking to start building a program, I highly encourage you to put in as many fields as you think are structured. So as much data as you can structure, you will later be able to use that in all kinds of creative and important ways. So for example, we recently had a .40 caliber homicide, and we were able to very quickly go through prior shootings and filter by .40 caliber to send over to the homicide investigator, hey, you may want to look at some of these recent events. I'm not sure whether or not this is in any way related to what you're working, but at least here's some stuff to start looking at, right? So you can really tailor your work to whatever are the needs of your jurisdiction by maintaining the data. So that's just a plug for my analysts and the, what we're doing and what we're keeping. So if that speaks to you, feel free to reach out to me later, and my analyst can talk to you a little bit more about the nitty-gritty. But let's go to the big picture. Next slide. The whole purpose of a crime strategies unit is successful prosecution. I mean, I'm a prosecutor, so of course I'm biased, but I think we would all agree that if you identify a shooter, we want to make sure that you can remove them from their criminality and you can be successful in your prosecution. The focus of our unit is person-based. So although we are analyzing crimes and locations that are being affected by gun violence, we need to know who held that gun, who pulled that trigger. And we want to remove crime drivers and shooters from the community. But always having a DA evaluating your cases for filing is really helpful on the front end, because it helps ensure that once you've solved this case, it gets filed. But not just filed, it's successful, right? So the theme of the Crime Strategies Unit, for those of you who don't recognize this handsome gentleman in this slide, that's Al Capone. And Cyrus Vance, the Manhattan DA, informing his Crime Strategies Unit, frequently says, if you have Al Capone, even if just on tax evasion, you need to know that he's Al Capone. But I'll go one step further than that and say, and you need to treat him like Al Capone. So it's not good enough to just be satisfied with saying, hey, look, we know that, that Al Capone committed a shooting with a .40 caliber on this day and date. You need to then have a successfully prosecuted and filed case that makes it all the way to conviction in order to ensure that he's no longer shooting people in that community. In part, what we do in order to ensure successful prosecution is we openly work with our federal partners to, when appropriate, send cases to them for prosecution. There are many categories of crimes that are more appropriately handled on the federal side, such as guns and drugs, and we have openly and actively sought a partnership with them. We're on a weekly call with them where we discuss these issues, and they attend our weekly gun intelligence meetings. We can go to the next slide. So my unit is an intelligence-driven prosecution unit. And what that means in practice and how it pertains to NIBIN is that there are 3 prongs of our intelligence-driven model. One is informed by the evidence, and that's literally the shell casings and guns and NIBIN leads. So that's the first part, like the evidence speaks to you, right? It tells you where the shootings are happening, what kinds of guns are being used, what kinds of people are doing these shootings. That comes from the gun itself, comes from the casings itself, it comes from the DNA swabs on the gun, it comes from the fingerprints, all of that. The evidence speaks to you. Then, of course, the investigation. We've worked very, very hard to cultivate partnerships with our detectives and patrol officers to educate them about the importance of universal collection, to get them bought in so that they're now reaching out to us when they have a major incident to say, hey, Marissa, can you reach out to the lab and have them rush these shell casings because we think it's linked to last week's shooting? And that happens now with great frequency, and that's super edifying because it means that we have buy-in from the critical parts. But I have to talk about this one on the bottom, human intelligence. Human intelligence, meaning source cultivation and talking to sources of information, has been the secret sauce in our particular model. Because a lot of times you'll have a shooting spree in a neighborhood and you can tell, you have little bits and pieces around the edge, right? There's a house party where there's a shooting, but witnesses are uncooperative. Then that links to an armed robbery the next week where there's a discharge when somebody's getting robbed at gunpoint. And then there's an incident the following week where a gang member gets pulled over with the weapon in the car. And all of those are linked by NIBIN, but nobody wants to give up who had the gun at the time of the shooting. But if you are actively working with partners and investigators in your jurisdiction to go to people who are maybe associated to the same criminal street gang and ask, do you know anything about that house party where there was a shooting? Do you know anything about that armed robbery? Guess what? It may be the big break in your case, and it has been for us time and time again, and I'll highlight a few of those examples. So if you don't already know people in your jurisdiction who are working with human intelligence, this is actually a great benefit of working with a prosecutor's office because we actually have the ability to know about cooperating witnesses, to help facilitate cooperating witnesses, and to get that secret sauce to get things across the finish line. So the next slide speaks to that. For intelligence sharing, none of this information means anything if you're just sitting on it yourself. So in keeping with the theme that Ron led with, which is collaboration, we have weekly meetings. And I know it's a lot, and not everybody comes every single week, but my team does. And we hold them every week because it's important for us to constantly be looking at and asking questions about who got arrested this week with a gun, what's the latest NIBIN lead, what jurisdiction is it coming from, what gang is it associated to, who do we think is the shooter. So we have these meetings so that we stay accountable and so that we're constantly aware of what's going on and that we share. We make summaries. So the GRIP summary, which I'll show in a little bit in a few slides down, but the GRIP summaries include all gun-related incidents from the prior week. And that includes gun recoveries from possession cases. That includes discharges, shots fired. Of course, it includes homicides and shootings. And it also highlights NIBIN links from the prior week. Our analysts look at these so that they can be aware of what gun crime really looks like in our jurisdiction. Now, we can do that because we have, less than 1,000 aggravated assaults with a firearm a year in our jurisdiction. So although it is a lot of content and my analysts spend a tremendous amount of time looking at this, it's not the kind of volume that you're seeing in some jurisdictions. So if you're on the line from Chicago, I do not suggest that you try to take this on. That is probably a bear that is way too large for you and a team of 3 analysts. But in our jurisdiction, it's a lot, but it is manageable, and we think necessary to get eyes on and make the links by looking at every incident. We don't talk about every incident in our weekly meetings. We talk about the highlighted ones, and that's a judgment call that our analysts are able to make because they're so familiar with what's going on in our county. So the more that you do this, the more you will be actually noticing things, because your analysts and your investigators who come to these meetings are like, oh my gosh, you mean that incident that we talked about 2 weeks ago? And you're making links in the meeting, and that happens to us all the time. Then focused investigations. So we're going to talk in a second about a major operation that we did, but we look at people, places, and problems, right? So we look at hotspots, we look at crime drivers, and we look at gangs. Because, I mean, let's be honest. NIBIN is talking about, by definition, 2 or more linked incidents, either a shooting linked to a gun recovery, or 2 or more shootings linked to one another, or a robbery linked to a shooting. And who does more than one gun-related crime? Not most criminals, right? So in our jurisdiction, and I'm sure it's the same with you, there is a very small group of people who are even going to be in the NIBIN universe. There's a very small group of people in our jurisdiction, mostly gangsters, who are going to pick up a gun and use it more than once. So knowing that and focusing on that and understanding your jurisdiction and who are the most likely people to be in that neighborhood with that type of weapon is really crucial to having informed discussions and focused investigations. And guess who can help with that? The prosecutor's office, because we have a gang team who sees a lot of these people, interviews a lot of these people, and we've really been a crucial component, I think, to the intelligence process. Next slide. All right, I want to talk about real examples now. So Operation Redwood. This case came to us very early on when we first started GRIP. It was in 2017, and one of our earliest NIBIN series was a series of multiple shootings that were all linked back to a 9mm gun. There were so many shootings linked to this gun that we gave it a name, and we realized that that this particular series of shootings with the 9mm was in a neighborhood known as Seven Trees in San Jose. This neighborhood has for years been plagued by a certain degree of gang violence, but it wasn't the only GRIP string that was happening in the neighborhood. So here we have this 9mm that we're all focusing on and we're looking at, but then there's other shootings where during the shooting, it was either happening in Seven Trees or it was associated to a Seven Trees gang, like they threw out the gang sign or symbol during the incident. And we're like, what's going on in this neighborhood that we're having all these linked shootings coming back there? So we linked it to a particular group, a particular criminal street gang. We linked it to a neighborhood, and we said, we need something more to understand what's going on here. And so we developed human intelligence. One of our investigators who works for my unit was aware that this particular neighborhood and this gang, there was a cooperating witness who had turned state's witness in another prosecution. So he went and visited him. He said, hey, I don't know if you're still willing to provide information on ongoing violence, but if you are, do you know anything about these shootings that are going on in Seven Trees? And he sure did. And without very much motivation needed, he's actually like, let me tell you what's been going on in the hood. And he basically lays out a whole bunch of incidents. He lays out houses that are dealing drugs, people who are selling guns, people who are committing shootings. And he also, during that interview, discussed 2 homicides. Sure enough, that linked up with the evidence, both the NIBIN leads and other crime gun recoveries that had happened in our jurisdiction, and allowed us to do a targeted series of search warrants in that neighborhood to recover guns, to arrest crime drivers, and to ultimately, as it turned out, obtain a confession from the homicide suspect in that sweep. So Operation Redwood was entirely a 3-tiered stool, right? It was first informed by the evidence. It made us look more closely when we had all these NIBIN leads at what on earth is going on here. But it required human intelligence to get across the finish line, and it required investigative support in order to go pull off an operation of that size. We recovered multiple firearms, including a fully automatic machine gun, an assault weapon, and then other NIBIN-linked guns, and lots of drugs. So that was a really important moment to go in and say, what's going on in this neighborhood? How can we address it? How do we use all the resources at our disposal to successfully address the violence that's going on there and make important arrests and prosecutions. So we developed human intelligence, relentless follow-up, reapproached witnesses with fresh information. So in your jurisdiction, if you have NIBIN leads, you may have seen, and I'm sure you have all the time, incidents where the witnesses are like, I know who did it, but I don't want to tell you. Or, yeah, I know who did it, but I'm afraid. Or, I'm not going to tell you who did it because there's gangsters in my neighborhood. But what ended up being successful in this case was reapproaching the witnesses after some passage of time and letting them know, hey, just so you know, like, you're not alone. There have been multiple shootings in this neighborhood. We have lots of cases that we're investigating, and this person is really active, and so we really need your help. And that ended up really inspiring the witness to then give information to our investigator in this particular series. If you go to the next slide. Remember I told you that we started looking more carefully at 7 trees because of one particular gun. So here's just a simple link chart that was done very early on, and I know my analyst is watching this webinar and is probably cringing because he doesn't like when I show this slide because it was an early version of this particular link chart, but I think it's a very elegant and simple way of displaying just how many shell casings were linked to different types of events. And this particular gun was used in an attempted murder, a drive-by shooting, a assault with a firearm, and a armed robbery. So lots of different crime, one gun. If we go to the next slide, it turns out our shooter is this young man right here, Anthony Davey, who's been charged with multiple counts of attempted murder. He was a rapper from this particular gang, and we were able to successfully break this case thanks to the hard work of our 3-pronged approach of evidence, investigation, and human intelligence. Next slide. So really, you have to pull on the threads. Once you see a hotspot or once you see a shooting series in NIBIN, you have to take the next logical step. Unlike a CODIS hit with DNA in California, where a hit automatically identifies a suspect, NIBIN is a lead, right? It doesn't tell you who held the gun. It just tells you that this gun was used at the same place in the same, in multiple incidents. So you have to do the work with your partners in order to identify suspects. You have to ask what's necessary here. And in this particular case, it required going and executing a series of coordinated search warrants in order to try and recover the weapons that were used and identify the perpetrators. It ultimately netted 8 arrests, multiple guns, solved a murder, and it was critical, and I really wanted to highlight this, to work with our federal partners. This was an OCDF-funded investigation. We were able to go get funding to go do an operation like this. So if you're somewhat intimidated and thinking, not in my jurisdiction, could we pull off something like that? We didn't think we could either, but this was literally led by the DA Office, Bureau of Investigations initially. And then when we went to the police department, they were super happy to join in, and they were absolutely wonderful. San Jose Police Department, when we came and said, can we reopen these cases, they were so wonderful to work with. They are the reason that it works in our jurisdiction. They have been open to us coming in and helping them. They have been true partners, and they've been open also to working with our federal partners. And by the way, that took that's a departure from prior experience in our county. So we're really grateful that it worked that way. If you go to the next slide. So remember I said our intelligence process out here is focused on people, places, and problems. So the problem being gun violence. The place-based analysis, though, is what do you do when you identify a hotspot? So this heat map, and again, one of my other analysts, I'm sure, is looking on and is cringing every time I put this up, but my analyst helped create this hotspot of gun-related incidents that map out your incidents. And she did, and she applied some heat mapping here. And the little flag that you see was our emerging hotspot of the 7 Trees neighborhood. But as you can see, we have several neighborhoods that are clear hotspots in San Jose where most of the gun violence, gun recoveries, drive-by shootings, and aggravated assaults occur. And so how do you help a hotspot? It is multi-tiered. You got to relentlessly follow up on the fact that NIBIN is pointing you in a direction. Investigators and your prosecutors and your analysts then have to say, okay, but what now? So if we can go to the next slide, I will tell you that This particular, I love putting guns and drugs on a table. I think it's really satisfying. Eddie Garcia, our police chief in San Jose, who is a genuine champion for collaborative approach to gun violence. This particular gun recovery was done by his SWAT team in San Jose, who were following up after an assault arrest and search warrant. And I have to tell this story as an inspirational message to those of you out there who can identify with this. So my third analyst, who I'm sure is listening, came to one of our GRIP meetings and said, hey, you guys, I just wanted to flag for your radar that there was an arrest and a shooting at this warehouse in San Jose that has come up in a few of our other gang intel meetings. And I noticed it because there was this particular gangster who was noted in the report, and he's been on our radar. So both because of the location and the people involved, she's like, what do we think's going on in this particular incident? And I'm like, I don't know. Let me read the reports. I read the reports and see that patrol had responded out to a shots fired call, had made some arrests of, little did they know, people who were on our radar for a series of incidents to do with GRIP and NIBIN and gun violence in our county. So I call patrol. I'm like, you have no idea what you stumbled upon, but I want to know more. Is there any chance that you'd be willing to follow up with a search warrant on the suspects involved in this case? And they're like, oh my gosh, absolutely. We've never done a search warrant before. This particular officer had been literally out of the academy for less than a year when he gets a call from the DA Crime Strategies Unit saying, let me help you write a warrant. Write a warrant to follow up on this case, find a ton of drugs, a ton of guns, and had actually uncovered a larger cartel-affiliated investigation and broke this case wide open because our analyst was like, this smells fishy, let's keep pulling on the thread. And you are going to have these cases time and time and time again in your jurisdiction where you're like, oh my gosh, so-and-so got arrested. And if you take the extra step of, dumping their phone with a search warrant or hitting their house with a search warrant, that's a critical piece now of what we do at GRIP, is looking at the people who are arrested with guns under suspicious circumstances from the week before. Like, for example, at last week's meeting, we noticed a gun arrest where inside of the vehicle were 5 known prolific offenders, 2 firearms, and a bunch of expended shell casings. 5 phones were recovered in that particular incident, and I've now requested that our investigator work to write a search warrant to look into the phone for evidence of whatever shooting had likely occurred just prior to our arrival on scene in that particular car stop. And so it's like pulling on and asking the questions of, okay, I have a crime driver, what do I do with him? And how can the DA's office help with that? So I want to go to the next slide to kind of underscore what we've done in that regard. This is a series of NIBIN-linked shootings that were associated to a particular gang. And we knew it was associated to a particular gang because our unit looked at and read all the associated incidents and said, look at the suspects who are involved in this. It's the usual suspects who we've been looking at for a lot of other things. And this is actually an instance where our analyst made an association to one of the linked shootings even before the ballistic confirmation had come back. He's like, I bet you anything that gun is going to link to this particular shooting based on the car and the suspects involved. And this series of shootings really helped us in prosecuting a known prolific gang out here called Lash Money Gang, who were responsible for over 300 violent and serious felonies in our county over the course of a year. So NIBIN was critical to that, and all of these links and the charting really helped our investigators understand and wrap their arms around the extent of the conduct and helped our analysts actually solve one of the shootings in this case. That was very important for us to focus on the gang, answer the questions that were being raised by the evidence. So I'm just going to quickly get through these final slides because I see we're getting to the end here. So sample products. We do case workups on a case-by-case basis, such as the link charts you saw. We do social media analysis, which is different from social network analysis, which is building out associated individuals. We do offender workups. We do prosecution support. All of my analysts have testified as expert witnesses in some form or fashion. And we do operational support, such as location workups for major operations like Redwood. Next slide. So here is, there we go. There is our gun-related intelligence program weekly product. It's been redacted, but you can essentially see that we look at and highlight certain shootings and robberies and NIBIN links, and share this at our meetings to inform our partners. Next slide. And critically, for any prosecutors listening, this has been a major new and important piece for us, which is that our analysts now do subject workups to communicate the dangerousness and risk factors of a certain subject with our prosecutors. So this is a mechanism to help us communicate to a line prosecutor, why is it that this person is Al Capone? What is it about this particular series of events that made him on our radar, led to this person being prosecuted in a special form or fashion to begin with? Next slide. We also do social media analysis, where we look at guns that we see on social media and help identify make and model so that the crime lab can be on the lookout for certain guns. Next slide. We also, of course, are doing the difficult work of linking massively linked crime series such as this supergroup, where several guns and shell casings across several jurisdictions were all linked with a common person or offender in the middle. Next slide. And so it's led to dramatic examples. I'm sure you have these kinds of things in your jurisdiction, but we had an instance, for example, that led to this particular newspaper article where there was a killing in East San Jose, and the critical lead came from a shell casing at a domestic violence incident in a county 2 counties away. So had it not been for that very on-the-ball domestic violence investigator submitting that shell casing, we would have had an unsolved cartel-affiliated homicide. Next slide. And it's these dramatic examples that lead to buy-in from our partners. We're moving towards spatial analysis, where we can use our structured location data to help inform our partners about certain clusters of shootings to help us better focus in on offenders and point our resources in the right direction. And final slide. Lessons learned. My main takeaway that I hope people can feel from this is prosecutors can help. We can help write warrants or review warrants. We can help coordinate across jurisdictional lines and bridge the gap between police departments, local and fed. We can help bridge the gap between crime labs and police officers. We can help the crime lab, which is something that I need to do more because they are literally our angels, which is when they call me and say, hey, Marissa, do we really need to swab and print this gun, or can we just do IBIS only? Please return their phone calls, prosecutors listening. The more we can do to help focus our resources and not do unnecessary work, the better. We can help elevate crimes from, a simple gun possession to one that has a gang enhancement on it. We can help flip sources by identifying them in the first place or facilitating a proffer agreement or a particular deal. Sometimes you need a prosecutor to do that. Police don't share easily, I have found, but they will share with prosecutors because it's in our mutual best interest. So lean on us, use us, and prosecutors who are listening, be there for your police partners. I am so lucky and grateful for the support that I've received from my police partners and from our lab partners, but it was a long process. And in the beginning, I think people were like, why are you putting this on us? And I think we all now are genuinely realizing that if we work together, we can share intel to solve cases. We can do relentless follow-up. I was going to talk about this example of the Corvette shooting, but I know we're basically out of time. But there's been countless examples of times when, because we all communicated, because we all shared information, and because we had a centralized unit whose job it was to do this, I think it takes some of the judgment out of it, and it really just focuses it on where it should be, which is on the criminals. So I hope that we can all maybe collaborate. And if you reach out to me, if you go to the final slide has my contact information, but feel free to ask questions about how we built this out here. We are very much a work in progress. As you can see, we're only 2 years old. But I think that some of our mistakes, hopefully, we can help you avoid, such as going in early on with some of these ideas for possible final products. I hope that this has been helpful for my colleagues out there on the prosecution side, but certainly my law enforcement and lab friends. Thank you so much for listening, and me and my analysts would be happy to collaborate with your jurisdiction to share our experience.
Wow, Marissa, Ron, what a fabulous presentation. Just great job. The discussion of your group and the true importance of true partnership and collaboration among the different professions was just absolutely spot on and fabulous. And this was a fantastic case study of how great gun crime partnerships can work, and we'd absolutely love to have you guys back. And folks, if you liked this webinar, then be sure to check out our incredible lineup of webinars for law enforcement on our law enforcement feature page, where you're going to find Ultra's next crime gun webinar. Some sustainable crime gun intelligence strategies require policy-driven tactics. All you need to do is go to the justiceclearinghouse.com website, navigate over to the featured button on the navigation bar, and drop down to law enforcement. And there you're going to find an incredible array of over 50 upcoming webinars for the rest of the year just for law enforcement. So be sure to check those out, because we'd absolutely love to have you join us. This was an incredible information-rich webinar, so hopefully we can get to a lot of your questions. But folks, if we don't get to your question, feel free to follow up with Marissa or Ron on their emails that you'll see there on the screen. So thank you so much. Ron, Marissa, we do have a ton of questions that have come in for you during the last hour, if you're ready.
Sure.
Do it.
First up, and Marissa, you were so right. Tony from your team was on the call today, and he shares that if you are a sworn law enforcement officer or crime or intel analyst, there's a distro available for you. So in order to join that group, you'll need to email Tony, and we'll make that information available to you all on the course page. So Tony, thank you so much for texting me and letting me know that. So we appreciate that. And Marissa, thank you for having Tony join us via audience. Next question.
Of course, you wouldn't miss it.
Fabulous. Marissa, Michelle asks if you would be willing to share a sample of that awesome spreadsheet that you showed about a half a dozen slides back, and not necessarily the case-specific information, but kind of the infrastructure of how you set that Excel spreadsheet up.
The fields, yeah. So, of course, yeah, we won't be able to share any of the case-specific info, but I would be more than happy to share the fields that we use so that you can see what we included. And also, if people reach out to me via email, I'll copy my lead analyst, Heather Sarge, and Tony LaRosa, who's the one we referenced earlier, who's one of our NIBIN analysts, who can explain why we included certain fields.
Oh, nice.
And honestly, some of the most important fields are ones that I wouldn't have anticipated early on. So it makes sense, of course, to include location information so that you can map it in programs that allow for spatial analysis. But honestly, one of the biggest things is whether or not there was a crime gun recovery. Because if we're looking backwards at, is this gun in custody on a particular shooting, you need to be able to answer, is this a crime gun recovery, or is this just shell casings at this stage and the gun is at large?
Fantastic. Yes, that'd be great. That'd be great. And I'll follow up with you after the webinar as well. Thank you. Marissa, Michelle asks if, oh, sorry, wrong question. Marissa, Kayla asks, why weren't you able to call it a CJIC?
Okay, so that's like a totally local thing. In our county, CJIC is the acronym for our primary justice database. So in our county, if you say CJIC, they think that you're referring to our main justice database, and it confuses them. So we had to give it a different acronym.
Talk about branding.
Yeah, exactly.
Fabulous. Thank you. That's a great clarification. Bruce emailed in and wanted to just share that his unit in Chattanooga, they have a great team that follows up on all leads, and NIBIN is done in-house with all leads and hits, and they're looked at immediately. So thank you, Bruce, for sharing that and contributing that to the conversation. Marissa, you mentioned that your organization was created, and you just kind of basically touched on that just really super briefly. Can you explain how your department was formed, how you got people to do it, or
yeah,
what was that impetus?
Yeah, so the Crime Strategies Unit was created by the Police Chiefs Association. I know that many of the people on the call are probably in a jurisdiction where the prosecutor's office either is creating or has created some version of a crime strategies unit. This is a movement that started a few years ago, really nationally, and we are part of that. So they're popping up in prosecutors' offices around the country. But why did we focus on crime gun intelligence so early on, and how did that get going, was very much because we had a lieutenant in our Bureau of Investigations who is just an awesome forward thinker, systems thinker, and he observed this as a need in our jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction, I should say, our crime lab is phenomenal, and we're very lucky that they've been using NIBIN and IBIS for years, right? But probably like many of your jurisdictions, we felt that it wasn't being used in collaboration with the police in a way that was optimizing the tool. So it was like if they had a homicide and they got a gun and they wanted to check whether or not that gun and that particular shooting were linked, like it would be used like that, right? But it wasn't being used proactively, and it wasn't asking the question of, can we develop intelligence from the lab itself? And this is a larger movement, right? So lab-led intelligence is not new, but it's really something that requires an infrastructure to analyze the data. So if you've got really, if you have ever met Pete Gagliardi or ever read any of his products, or many of the other great people at ATF who have really encouraged this movement nationally for crime gun intelligence, it's based on this concept that it's not enough to just process the casings. It's not enough to just, work a single shooting. If you really want to optimize this practice of guns leading to intelligence-driven cases and prosecutions, you have to have it all integrated. Like, who are the people who are shooting the guns? Who are the gangs? Where is it happening? And that doesn't, no crime lab analyst can do that on their own. No detective in a gang department it can do it on their own, because they're not making the linkages without everybody communicating with one another. So as we were looking at an intelligence-driven model in our county, we couldn't ignore the fact that gun crime was the biggest issue we were facing, and we couldn't ignore the fact that one of our greatest assets was already inbuilt, which was that, we had a great lab. And we also, in our jurisdiction, we're very, very lucky that it is a DA office run and funded crime lab. So we had a certain degree of control over making an application for additional firearms examiners from within the DA's office. So it was a natural marriage to say, hey, this is a priority for us to address gun crime in a proactive way. We need more people to do it. How many people? Let's talk about it. How many guns? Let's talk about it. But this was the natural place to go in our county if we were going to do anything intel-driven. Guns was our issue. We had an ability to impact it. So we're like, let's do it.
Fabulous. Next question. James wants to know, do you track the difference between self-defense versus offensive incidents?
No, not through this program. I mean, and to be honest with you, not really at the DA's office.
Okay.
So, if there's a true self-defense claim, it would not be a filed criminal case, right? But on the investigative side, whether or not the gun was used defensively would be extremely challenging if you don't even know who used it. And in our instance, and I'm sure in most of the cases around the country, so many of these shootings are entirely unsolved. So to the extent that you've solved it, you're at the 2-yard line. To the extent that you've identified a shooter and a motivation, you're over the goal line. So that's really far into the process, but no, we do not track that.
Got it. Excellent. Next question. Ron, you talked about differentiating the issue of differentiating needs versus wants. So I want more testing, but do you really need more testing? But getting people in the system to think differently and accept change and nuances like what you talked about can be really hard. How do we help people adapt and accept these new ways of doing things?
It can be difficult. And generally, the way that I've been successful in doing that is by showing individuals or showing functions of an agency a vision for a better future. Because law enforcement agencies currently are fighting so hard simply to react to crime that what I do is I find success stories of cities such as Cincinnati where they've actually reduced the number of shooting incidents from one quarter of one year to the same quarter the following year. And I talk about all these strategies for crime labs when I've gone to speak with at seminars and where I have a lot of forensic people in front of me, basically I've had to bring pictures of victims of crimes because we are so tied into the evidence and we get so focused on the evidence that we forget that sometimes that there's lives behind the evidence. And I think what has to happen is that we really have to look at compassion as a lifestyle instead of an event. We oftentimes will go to serve at various places like Thanksgiving or homeless shelter or what have you. But if we start looking at compassion as a lifestyle, then we get more in touch. We don't get disabled by what's happening in our community, but we get motivated by what's happening to try and get it to change through compassion. So I appeal to individuals' compassion and a desire to truly make a difference. I'm tired of reacting to crimes. I want to do something about a crime problem. And how we look at that and how we address that, sometimes that's a better vision than simply, okay, I just need to change.
I like that. That's fabulous. Last question for the day, folks, and it's a biggie, and certainly Ron and Marissa, both of you can contribute to this. We know that there is a turnover issue, an attrition problem, and a recruiting problem that a lot of law enforcement agencies are facing. What is the role of attrition and turnover in working gun crime cases? We hear of these challenges in law enforcement. Is retention and turnover an issue for prosecutors as well as forensics analysts as well? And how does this turnover affect our ability to be able to investigate gun crimes efficiently and effectively?
Yes, it's a problem. All right, so in my experience, the biggest issue where this really becomes a problem is I think that the cops who are working in investigative capacity are going to be like, let's say that they're on the homicide unit or the gang unit. That's a limited term here. I'm sure it is in departments across the country, right? So just about the time that you start to realize what NIBIN is and how it can help you in your investigation, you're out on patrol. So I've really tried to embrace this reality by acknowledging that if patrol has even just a general idea of what IBIS is and why it's important, and you give feedback. So I promised that I would come back to this feedback issue at some stage that I flagged really early on in my presentation about our workflow. Feedback is critical, and it's actually kind of responsive to what Ron was just talking about, which is how do you get people to buy in, and how do you combat this issue of attrition, which is you tell the success stories every time that they happen to as many audiences as possible. You tell that success story about that little patrol cop who did a follow-up on a search warrant that broke open a cartel case. You tell that to his patrol team, who then tells it to their friends, who then tells it to their friends, so that at some point when they're working in the bureau, they remember that if you see something, say something, reach out and what's that NIBIN thing? And anytime I go and train cops, I'm always you may not remember exactly what it is that I said to you, but I want you to remember me. I want you to remember that there is a unit out there that has to do with guns. And if you have a case with a weird gun pinch where you just kind of suspect that they just came from a shooting, do something about it. Reach out to the detective bureau, So where attrition has really impacted us, and I think I alluded to it very early on in my presentation, was there was all these cops who at the time that they submitted the evidence, they were really into that case. But, even a week later, you've moved on to the next 3 shootings, right? So you may not even check your email by the time you get an IBIS hit. And so one of the things that Pete Gagliardi really taught us in our county was speed is crucial. You got to give the lead to the investigator, not only while he's still working in that unit, but while he's still working on that case. So attrition generally is devastating to ongoing investigations, which is why you need a unit whose job it is to bridge the divide that is bigger than a person and bigger than a single case. It is a system that looks at these issues and is not dependent on one cop or another or one, lab tech or another. It is a system that ensures that every gun, every casing, every NIBIN lead, every time is looked at and analyzed in case somebody changes assignment, someone's looking at it.
Fantastic.
And from a forensic lab point of view, the issue of attrition is critical actually for the NIBIN positions, where the NIBIN technician positions, because oftentimes laboratories are hiring the wrong people. There's a certain personality style that really embraces the job of a technician, especially where it's so computer based. And it's important, and sometimes we have to violate our best common instincts. Whenever we're interviewing people for positions, we want all these self-starters, and we want this type of person. We want a real go-getter. We want somebody who doesn't need much in terms of supervision. They can seek their training on their own. But those individuals are also highly motivated to continue an upward climb in whatever profession they're choosing. So what we have to do is, when we're interviewing individuals, sometimes we have to target certain personality types. And there are questions that you can ask in your interview that will actually identify which personality type of individual is. And it's those individuals of a certain personality type that we want for that position.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And we'd love to have you guys back and talk more about these topics. Thank you so much for your presentation today. What an amazing amount of information in such a short period of time, and everybody clearly got a lot from it. And folks, be sure to join us right back here tomorrow when Dwayne Bowers is back to talk about the impact of trauma on child development, what justice professionals need to know. So be sure to join us, or have somebody from your organization join us if you can. And with that, that concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow. Bye now.